Welcome to Leadership Development News, Profiles and Practices of Top Performers. I'm Dr. Relly Nadler, Dr. Kathy Greenberg, my esteemed co-host. Between Kathy and I, we've been doing this for 18 years now. We've helped thousands of people to perform in the top 10%. And what we're always looking for is what are some tools, what are some tips, what are some things that you can do maybe a little differently, maybe a lot differently. What are some things that you can pass on to your team for these small tips to move forward? Today, we're going to talk with Stephen Collis, uh, Habits of a Peacemaker, Practical Tools to Change Our Potentially Toxic Conversations into Healthy Dialogues. I'm very interested in this, just bring it to organizations. Stephen and I were just talking for a moment ahead of time. People really don't know how to deal with conflict. I mean, there's skills involved, and I think for most people, we want to avoid conflict. And so we're going to tap Stephen for some of his tips and tools. I think he's got 10 of them in his new book that just came out a couple months ago. And then we're going to move forward. And Kathy, welcome to our show today.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. We're finally getting some nice weather in my region, but it seems like, so many people across the nation are being hit with some bad weather. And of course, our hearts go out to everybody out there in the California area.
Yep. Yeah, I'm about 90 miles north of Los Angeles. And if you listen to this time, atrocious. Over 12,000 structures have been burned. We've had fires here back in Santa Barbara in the past, and it's going to take forever
Yeah,
to.
I don't know if you saw the little video clip I sent you. So for those of us who are listening, you can probably go on to the CNN website. So my cousin was on the air
Oh,
on Thursday night with CNN or Friday night, and his home was destroyed, and his in-laws were evacuated, and it's his 7-year-old's eighth birthday on the 15th of January. And so the family is aggregating together and creating a birthday party for her. Talk about the need for civility.
yeah. Wow. Well, yes, like you said, our hearts go out. We'll do a quick little intro, and then we're going to tap Stephen for how to deal with conflict. What are some of the things that he's learned? So we know some of the data that we like to present ahead of time. This comes from Gallup. About 75% of us could use more emotional support. So we're talking about some of the, just in general, and this is prior to what we've just talked about going on in LA and other parts of the country. And is that you? Do you need more emotional support? Does your team need more emotional support? So they're looking at the leader and for the leader to be able to provide that. And then some of our newer research just about some of the blind spots that managers have. Again, this is from Gallup. Recognizing good work. Well, 59% of managers say, oh, yeah, I do that. Only 35% of the direct reports say they recognize good work. Provide weekly feedback, which could go back into what Stephen's going to talk about is conflict. Well, managers say, oh, yeah, 50% of the time, 50% of managers say, I do that. Direct reports, only it happens 20%. And as far as people who are thriving or struggling, the newest research says about 50% of workers are thriving, 45% are struggling. So it's going to be really some of the key aspects of a manager or a tool, some of the communication that we're going to tap Stephen for. And
Yeah.
so,
You want me to jump in here?
yeah, maybe to
Yeah.
introduce Stephen. Yeah.
Yeah, you bet. So, one of the things that we're very excited about having Stephen on the show today is his new book, and it's The Habits of a Peacemaker, 10 Habits to Change Our Potentially Toxic Conversations into Healthy Dialogue. And I think you made reference to that earlier. And, one of the things I'm really excited about is the practical, humbling path to a better, more genuinely productive and empathetic conversation with anybody, which all of us can use. As a law professor specializing in the First Amendment and a leading expert on civil discourse, Collis has built his career navigating some of the most diverse issues facing our world today. He's bridged gaps between people across the ideological spectrum, academics, diplomats, foreign and domestic judges, all kinds of high schoolers. You think about what's going on, oh my gosh, across education. We really sorely need it in our schools. Religious leaders, college and graduate students, and even devout churchgoers, devout atheists and agnostics, and members of the LGBTQ community, and those who believe in traditional, well, notions of sexuality, and essentially people who are, well, perhaps most poised to disagree with each other, right? I mean, if you look at all these groups, they're it. I think one of the things that we're going to learn today is how many of these keys to creating civil discourse between theoretically opposing parties can actually be learned. And we're going to talk about them in our show today. We're going to talk about reframing. We're going to talk about opportunities to learn rather than argue, one of my favorite all-time ways of doing anything, recognizing our intellectual limitations and acknowledging some of our basic biases, which goes to our emotional intelligence and so much more. So let's jump in here. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to talk with both of you. I'm excited to learn from you as well.
Thanks, Stephen. So we always want to kind of touch base about kind of your key influences and maybe how this led to maybe this topic of dealing with conflict. There's always little strains of experiences that kind of lead us to where we're at now. So, a couple things. Maybe what's a little bit of background, maybe your influences, and kind of why this topic.
Yeah, the best way to think of my influences related to this topic is I spend my days as a First Amendment law professor traveling around the globe talking about First Amendment freedoms and all of the controversies that spill off of those freedoms, right? So you've got the freedoms of religion, speech, and the press, as well as the right to assemble and petition the government. And what spills off of those rights are all sorts of the most divisive issues in the world, right? Abortion rights, LGBTQ plus rights, academic freedom, campus protests, all these things that really roil our discourse. And what I found was, as I travel around the globe talking with folks in various conferences about these issues, I was often having very productive conversations with people on these issues, including folks with whom I disagree deeply or people who disagree with one another. And it got me wondering, what was it that we're all doing that allows us to make these conversations productive when in most instances these topics just devolve into screaming and yelling matches, right? And it started, so I spent the last 3 years really thinking and trying to identify what are the habits that we're all engaged in that are making these conversations productive? How do we define productivity when it comes to having a productive conversation, right? And then how can I figure out what the scientific basis is for these habits and kind of distill this down into a book that lay people can take and then apply them in any difficult conversation in their lives. It doesn't have to be these hot button political topics. We all have difficult conversations, employers to employees, right? Employees with one another, parents to children, children to parents. In my world, professors to teachers and back and forth, right? We all have difficult conversations, and how can we take habits that are proven to work and try to build them into our lives to make conversations better? And I do not pretend to be the master of all of these habits. That would be way too pretentious, but I've learned from a lot of other people and tried to distill them in the book, whether or not I'm a master at them or not. In fact, some of them I readily admit I'm horrible at. So
Well, we have a lot in common, so
there you go. Yeah.
it'll
Yeah.
work out really well. As we're sitting here talking, and I know Relly's giggling to himself after being my partner in crime here for 18 years. People call me the PI, the professional interrupter. And this is just a cultural thing for me. I was raised in a very strong ethnic household where if you had an opinion and you didn't get it in there, it wasn't going to be heard. And then being, raised in that genre of being the first, I was the first female to join a huge, huge global consulting firm as a partner from the outside of that organization, which was like coming in with a target on your back. I was, the first woman to do a lot of things, the first woman to get into the private club that I'm in. I mean, I grew up in an environment where if you didn't speak up, you weren't going to be heard. And so, I've had to learn, thank God I have Relly, to pull back and not be so quick to assume that everybody else understands that. So I'm really excited for today. What is one of the unmistakable signs that discourse has gone awry? Because I work a lot with law enforcement and public safety professionals, and man, they just say hello and it's gone awry.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I just look at the polarization of the country today, right? It's actually often what social scientists call a false polarization. We think we are far more divided than we actually are, but the reason for that is because of the echo chambers that we're all in and the inability to have communication, and the internet exacerbates that. It actually rewards it, right? It rewards pretty much the opposite constantly of productive discourse. And all of that are the symptoms of the times. The question is, once we're aware of the problem and we realize that all of us can be susceptible to the problem, which is our modern technology kind of ecosystem causing us to be able to have less productive conversations. Once we're aware of that problem, what can we as individuals then do about it? But those symptoms are everywhere, and they're not just in the U.S. It's in Canada. Really, the entire Western world, especially the English-speaking world, but really the entire Western world is experiencing the same dynamic, and much of it is driven by our current technology and the way social media algorithms work and whatnot.
So, well, from your research, and I imagine just the research and conversations with folks, we a lot of times talk about self-awareness, and I think for the emotional intelligence world, what are you aware of? How do you manage it? Those are kind of the key things. So, how do you know, like, what are people experiencing? What's the first sign that, uh-oh, this is not working?
You mean like a conversation is not working?
Yeah.
Yeah, the moment you start feeling you're getting angry or your emotions are getting riled up or people are starting to attack one another, it's not working. But your comment about self-awareness is critical, I think, because the first habit I talk about in the book that I identified among people who are really good peacemakers, and I define a peacemaker as someone who can have a productive conversation about a hard topic. So that's important. We're not talking about dodging hard topics. We're not talking about just keeping the peace by being silent. We're talking about how do we actually address, truly difficult topics and make progress on them. But the first habit is self-awareness about how little we all actually know. Developing intellectual humility. I emphasize this story in the book. I get paid full time, and I have now for 15 years to do nothing but sit around and think about and write about and teach about the First Amendment. And I would guess I know about 5% of what I think is available out there in the world about the First Amendment. When I start to think about all the possible questions that could be answered, you start to realize how little you actually know. And that's the one topic that I'm paid to do nothing but think about full time. So how much do I actually know about all the other things I might be inclined to argue about with people, right? Even in our family lives, I emphasize a story in the book of, when grandparents come to visit their adult children and their grandchildren. So let's say they're there for 3 days and they leave with all sorts of opinions about what their children are doing wrong and their parenting and how they need to change everything. And they blast off an email and there's all these problems, right? Think about how much information those grandparents actually have. 3 days is less than 1% of the calendar year. And they've observed it for part of that time, and yet they now think they're in a position to have all the knowledge in the world to chastise their children, right? But if they would just recognize maybe that they don't know everything, that the knowledge about that situation is so limited, it allows them to kind of change their approach. So that self-awareness and developing intellectual humility is critical.
Yeah, that is so powerful because I'm one of those people. I don't say anything. I've learned. I have
You don't say,
adult
really? You
grown.
don't say anything?
I don't. I've learned how to bite my tongue. And to your point, Stephen, there was one and only one time in the past 9 years of my granddaughter's life that I made a comment, and it was this Thanksgiving, because it's, we all know there are holidays that have some traditions.
Yeah.
And some of us want to keep those traditions. And when a 9-year-old girl thinks it's tradition for her to sit at the head of the table instead of her parent, that kind of, went a little sideways. But my point is that's the worst I've ever done. That's the worst. Because I believe, as you said rightly, and I believe many people who are listening are probably having a giggle, that I've had to learn to recognize that it's an artificial environment. Now, here's a perspective for you, Stephen. I studied primates, and I studied them for a decade before I was allowed to work with human beings. And one of the things that we really had to learn to be in that environment was to suspend all judgment about the interactions going on, because you weren't there prior to the existing context. And it's funny, I've been able to use that in my work life, and I do really well when I'm doing my coach role and being non-judgmental. Put me in a family environment and everything goes to hell in a handbasket.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we all have areas where it's easier for us than others, right? But that situation you just described is perfect. Think about how many questions you probably need to get answered before you could properly deal with the situation of the 9-year-old sitting at the head of the table, right? Is this common? Is there some executive functioning thing going on? Do their parents approve? Have their parents already spent hours trying to convince this kid that this is not a good idea, but decided that they're not going to have a fight now over it, right? Like there's
That was
so many,
it.
yeah, there's
Yeah,
so many questions that you need to answer before you jump in. And we do this all the
yeah,
time on all sorts of topics. We have no information. None of us on either side of a conversation knows anything.
right.
And yet we'll sit there and argue for hours on the 0.01% that we actually do know, right? So that recognizing our own lack of knowledge on most topics and just having some intellectual humility goes a long way
Well,
to
I have
help.
I have no intellectual humility, and Relly knows that I'm gonna definitely power through here and tell you everything I know in 1 minute because we have to go to a break, but we'll be right back. So don't go away. You're listening to Leadership Development News. We're having an enjoyable conversation with Steve Collis on the First Amendment and being a little bit more civil. So come right back.
Welcome back to Leadership Development News. We're talking with Stephen Collis, and let me give you his website. It's Stephen with Stevent Collis, Collis at gmail.com. I guess that's his email, and then Stephen will get from you if people want to get the book, obviously with Amazon and other places. But so we talked about this intellectual humility, and that's where this awareness comes. And and am I the smartest person in the room? One of the derailers that we talk about. But what if you're talking with somebody who does not have intellectual humility, and you're that self-awareness is they don't know what the heck they're talking about. They are so off base. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, there's a couple tricks you can use. First off, I do have a section in the chapter about intellectual humility. The very last section is titled, what if you're the expert? So you're the expert in the room. You're dealing with people who aren't experts. How do you deal with it? The first thing I write, though, is if you're confident that you're the expert on more than one or two topics, if you think you're the expert on everything, go back and reread the section about intellectual humility, right? Like if you always strut into a situation thinking you're the expert, you're probably the source of the problem. Now, that said, let's say you really are an expert, and we all are on something, right? All of us are an expert on something, even if it's just our interactions daily in our homes. We know that better than anybody else, right? Part of one of the first things you want to do is wait for an opening. So it's important. This might be hard for Kathy, as she just said she's used to coming in hot, right? But sometimes you want to wait until people turn to you and somebody recognizes, hey, you know a lot about this. If you can wait and be patient, that often is a great opportunity. Now, sometimes that opportunity doesn't come. I get that, and we'll talk about that in a second. But waiting until the opportunity does come can be absolutely critical, because at that point, the people in the room are going to then be interested in what you have to say rather than you injecting in. It's also critical not to brag about your position of authority, right? Nobody wants to hear from somebody about why they are the expert and should be listened to when you're talking about a difficult topic. It's far better to kind of show your expertise through the comments you make and helping people understand the complexity of a situation rather than to come in and be like, well, look, I'm a First Amendment scholar. You should listen to what I have to say. Nobody's impressed by that. They just aren't, right? Finally, occasionally we're dealing with people who simply are not going to recognize someone else's expertise, and they are not going to recognize their own lack of expertise. They just simply aren't. And in that situation, the question then becomes, what is progress? What makes the conversation productive? Just arguing with that person, in my view, is not going to make for a productive outcome. You're just going to end up everyone angry and leaving angry, and no one will have made any progress. There, I find it's okay to simply explore this person and try to understand how they reached the conclusions they did. You're playing the long game with a lot of topics. Some topics you have to reach a conclusion immediately, but most of the time, we're playing a long game, and it's just helpful to understand, how did this particular person get to where they are, that they just feel like on this topic they are the most expert person on earth and nobody can dare challenge them. What were their experiences? That, if you just come away with that understanding, that'll better prepare you for the next conversation, and that, in my mind, is productive discourse there. So being patient, trying to understand them better is really helpful.
Now, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the world in which, I'm operating. And I already told you a little clue here that I do a lot of work with professional law enforcement across the nation, but that also includes, federal agencies and special forces and special operations. Now, I can tell you that on a scale of 1 to 10, that level of intellectual humility will change from special forces and special operators to law enforcement. And I think the biggest issue there, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is because when we talk about contentious issues and we talk about having some intellectual humility, it's really hard to argue with the police officer whose job it is to enforce code, whether it's code of conduct or code of the law. I'm just curious, when law enforcement professionals are obviously facing all kinds of criticisms, which they do, and that's why I'm in their industry right now, teaching them how to coach versus just, come unhinged.
Sure.
what is it that a human being, just the normal human being, the average Joe or Jane, can do when an officer says something that they know is just inaccurate, but because they are the law, the civilian doesn't really have a lot that they can do in that situation. So just playing with that idea.
I mean, that, you're talking about I assume in my mind, it seems to me that could be any number of situations you're describing here. And in my mind, I'm picturing a very fast moving situation that could potentially escalate and get dangerous quickly. And how do you handle that? I mean, I do think all people probably need to recognize that they're in a position where trying to win on a particular point is not going to be useful in that moment, right? You can recognize if you're being arrested or if a cop is questioning you about something or it's a very difficult situation, that there will come a time when you can state your position and help people understand the facts. It may not be doing that right in the moment when the cop is just trying to get a situation under control, right?
Yeah.
And that's critical, I think.
Oh, that's a great answer.
I
Impulse
think
control.
one of the things, Stephen, that we talked about, that Kathy and I talked about is in coaching is get people off their fast moving conclusion. They jump to a conclusion, and so we have this model called the assumption ladder, where we kind of walk them down, and it's a real questioning process. Tell me a little bit more, or what makes you say that? So it really comes from that curiosity. And I love what you said. When you walk someone down, it's almost like, how do you get there? I know what your conclusion is. I'm curious about how you got there. What's the data? What's the information? For a long time, I had a partner who was an MBA from Harvard, and super smart, way smarter than me, and he would try to hold the floor in his conversation, because he's the expert. But I learned as soon as I asked a couple of questions, his certainty would loosen. Well, what makes you say that? Or you think that's going to happen in every situation? Or what if people disagree with you? And all of a sudden, that uncertainty. So say a little bit more about, when someone's really certain, and that's kind of where they're going, we know about listening. What else is some of your habits to maybe bring in a space either for yourself or for them to entertain some other data?
Well, I like what you just said there because it ties into chapter 3 in my book, which is I find peacemakers are very good about assuming the best about the people with whom they're dialoguing. And what I mean by that is um, they assume that the people with whom they're talking have, at the very bottom, have good motivations for why they reached the conclusions they did. And they
Right.
don't just assume right off the gate that the person is a fool or a monster. Most of us tend to walk around life thinking that there's three kinds of people. There's the people who agree with us, and then there are fools and monsters, right? And that doesn't really work. Peacemakers don't start with those assumptions. Now, look, the world is filled with fools and monsters. We know that, but they don't assume right out of the gate that that's what they're dealing with. And so, to really get to the bottom of the motivations of the people they're talking to, they ask questions just like you were describing, Relly. And the key, though, notice the questions you were just modeling. Those were not rhetorical points where you were trying to prove somebody wrong. You were modeling sincere questions to understand how someone reached a conclusion. And the moment you're asking questions to try to prove someone wrong, if they're rhetorical questions, you're just putting them on the defensive and they're going to get more and more argumentative. So you genuinely have to be trying to understand them and ask questions accordingly. And there's some research I point to in the book that's interesting on this. If you ask people questions to justify their position, their conclusion, they more often than not are going to get defensive and argumentative. If you ask them questions about, the same research shows, if you ask them questions about what the repercussions of their conclusion will be, you say something like, well, can we just play this out? I want to see what your opinion on defund the
Yeah.
police, Kathy, since you brought up law enforcement, your opinion on defund the police. Can we just think through what the repercussions will be? How will this impact things down the road? People actually tend to soften their positions as they try to explain through what the repercussions will be.
Yeah. Yeah.
Again, as long as you're not asking rhetorical questions to prove them wrong, you're just trying to explore it with them.
Right.
And yeah, one of the golden rules of coaching, which I hope everybody is keeping in mind here, is using the word why. I have such a problem with Simon Sinek. No offense, Simon, but the constantly asking the why, because the why is going to get you that reaction. because now you are questioning someone's beliefs, and therein lies their biases, therein lies their unfortunate boundaries around themselves and others, and you're just leading them down their own path. So I always explain to people in coaching, we try to avoid the why, and what
Yeah.
you just said is the reason. I love it.
So, so Stephen, one of the questions that we have, and this is then get a little more personal for you. What's one of the most memorable conversations that you've had over the course of your career?
Oh, that's a tough one. The one that pops into my mind is, I was once asked to speak to an audience of about 5,000 teenagers about how to balance religious liberty rights and claims with LGBTQ plus rights to
Whoa.
equality, right? So it's a very hot button issue. Teenagers who, can fly off the handle pretty quick and talk about, they're probably in the absolute worst state of being where they think they know everything and know absolutely nothing, right? So it's a very hot button situation. The meeting went off fine. It was wonderful. What made it powerful for me was at the end, a young person came up to me and started chatting with me, and we talked for about a half hour. And I just had this powerful, and we really got to explore these things in depth, employing many of the same techniques we've been talking about here. And I just had this powerful feeling that I was there to talk to that one person. It wasn't about the fight. I wasn't talking to this big crowd. It was like I was there to touch this one person and just help them and help me see things a little bit differently with a little bit more nuance. And for me, that was a really powerful moment that I'll always remember. It was connecting with the one, rather than worrying about the grand size of the
Yeah,
audience.
and I think, Stephen, one of the things that we've all learned doing this job out there in the big wide world is that one person touches us and gives us that insight. And so I always encourage people, to the point you just made, regardless of whether your comment is good or bad, right or wrong, positive or negative, whatever it is, come talk to those people like us that are out there trying to help others. And if we've made a difference on either side of that equation, isn't it nice to share it with us? And if we've done something that causes us to maybe have more awareness about the things that we're espousing in public, I'm grateful for that feedback and that opportunity to hear where I may have done some injury that was not intended by words, because words matter. I have a question for you. Here's something that I'm really interested in these days. This gaslight effect.
Hmm.
And do you handle that in the book?
I do. I talk about gaslighting, and there's a section in the book where I'm talking about, how to hunt for the best. So another thing peacemakers engage in, one of the chapters is they hunt for the best argument against their position, against their view on something. And one of the problems with gaslighting, I'll give a definition in a minute, is that it keeps you from finding and identifying the best argument against your position, right? So gaslighting harkens back to this play that was written and then turned into a movie about a man that kept changing the level of the gas lights in his house from brighter to darker to try to make his wife think she was going insane, right? So he's changing things to kind of make her think that she's not perceiving reality the right way, and it then became a rhetorical type of argument. People are very gifted at this, and many of them do it naturally. You can see 4 and 5 year olds doing this incredibly well. The example I give in the book is a mom turns to her daughter and says, "Hey, don't forget to take out the trash." And the daughter says, "Why are you always yelling at me?" That is gaslighting. Notice what the daughter has done. She shifted the topic, and she's made the mom start to question her reality. Right? She's saying she's shifted. We're not even talking about trash anymore. Now we're talking about the reality of, is the mom always yelling at her daughter? Now, the moment the mom says, "I don't always yell at you," the mom has taken the gaslighting bait. And what the daughter will do is keep shifting it. "Yes, you do. No, I don't. Yes, you yelled at me last week. When did I yell at you? That time I wanted to go play with my friends." Suddenly you're 17 topics away, and you're not even on the topic of the trash anymore. And so what someone needs to do is just say, the daughter says, "Why are you always yelling at me?" And the mom says, "You know what? We can talk about that another time. I'm not going to let you change the topic. Right now, you need to do your chore," and end it. right? And you have to recognize when someone is shifting the topic because that is the key indicator of gaslighting. They're shifting the topic on you just slightly. If you
Yeah.
start to argue, they'll do it again and again and again and again, and you'll be 15 topics away, and you won't even remember what the original point of the conversation was. And I had a son, I know we're heading up on a break here. I'll just finish with this. I had a son who was a master gaslighter. I mean, just one of the best ever. And when he was about 9 years old, I realized it, and I told him, I said, hey, I'm not going to let you change the topic. We're talking about whatever it is. I'm not going to let you change the topic. And he came up to me about 5 years later and he said, Dad, you know how you always told me I was changing the topic? He was like, You're right. That's exactly what I was doing, but I didn't realize it. He was just doing it by instinct
Wow.
because he knew he could get out of being in trouble. So,
Yeah. So
Well,
it's
I'm gonna try that one now, definitely.
it's
Watch
really
out,
about kind of that
Daddy.
it's that spotlight that's on them and they're feeling defensive and so they're changing that spotlight. It is interesting that with the metaphor of the gaslight, they're kind of shedding light on something else when that's happening. And so what we talk about a lot of times is helping people be assertive. And so one of the assertive techniques is the broken record.
yeah,
And so just like you said, you go, okay, we're not talking about that, and you just keep going. And so if you kind of be aware of it's once you have the broken record and you say it 2 or 3 times, it's easy for you because they can't keep gaslighting because you're not taking any of the bait.
that's right. And it usually, gaslighting usually comes in the form of an accusation, again, to make you
Yeah.
question your reality. So you can't take
Good.
the bait. You just say, Hey, wait a minute. We're not going to talk about that right now. We're focused on this topic.
Yeah.
Yep, you try living with a US Navy SEAL who's your husband who does that every day, and I will tell you it's exhausting.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure.
I've learned every trick in the book to keep him on target.
Well,
All right, speaking of targets, we're going to go to a quick break. So don't go away. We'll be right back. You're listening to Leadership Development News.
welcome back to Leadership Development News, profiles and practices of top performers. You can always tap on to Kathy Greenberg or me, Dr. Rowan Adler, to find out more of kind of our courses and things that we do. And if you want more information, for Stephen, his website is StephenTCollis.com. Stephen T. Collis, Stephen Steven, Collis, Collis. So, Stephen, one of the things that I think you have in your book is the realm of reasonableness. What is that?
Yeah, that's an idea. I've finally had to come up with a word for it, but it's this notion that oftentimes people take positions on things that are within what we might call the realm of reasonableness. It's a reasonable position, even if we might disagree with it. And recognizing that someone's position is within the realm of reasonableness is a really good starting point, or recognizing if it's so far outside the realm of reasonableness that you realize, making progress is probably going to be very small incremental steps with somebody. But this is in my last chapter, and what I talk about in that chapter is how peacemakers are able to, what I call, embrace the discomfort of non-closure. And what I mean
Hmm.
by that is, kind of goes back to what we were talking about before. A productive conversation can just be one in which you come to understand why somebody feels the way they do about something, right? Right. It's all you do in that particular conversation. Recognizing that winning the day on that conversation or getting them to change their mind is going to be a long-term endeavor. It's not going to be something you're going to do in one conversation. And so you can embrace the idea that the conversation can end on a positive note with you just understanding them better, or perhaps them understanding you better, or the two of you just inching towards some solution to a shared problem. Um, and part of the key of being able to embrace that discomfort of non-closure is recognizing that oftentimes people will disagree with us on something, and we may disagree adamantly about it, but their position is within the realm of reasonableness. It may well just be that you have very different information from your starting points, right? Or very different life experiences informing how you reached your conclusions. But if they're within the realm of reasonableness, don't treat them like some kind of horrible monster. Figure out how they reach their conclusion. Why are you two in different places on a spectrum in terms of the topic you're talking about, and try to understand how they got where they are. And over time, hopefully they can understand how you got where you were. If you just assume that anyone who disagrees with you is unreasonable, it's almost impossible to then start having healthy conversations on any given point of disagreement.
You know what I love about this, and really, I'm sure you're thinking this as well, and I'm sure our audience, which is mostly, business coaches and professionals who work in our industry, they're recognizing the power of simple awareness. As coaches, I'm sure as attorneys, you've come across many of them in your career, Stephen, coaches as well. Everybody's looking for a result. I want a result. I want this goal met, and I want it now. Not that we charge, hourly the way an attorney does, but it can still be painful to get a bill from a coach because you didn't get a result. Well, a result can simply be awareness
Hmm.
about the situation that you are in, whether it's a situation that you've created yourself or a situation that has been created as a result of an action that you were a part of. Could be a philosophy, a belief, as you've already, kind of articulated early on in the show, a religious, perspective, a notion about, gender or anything else, right? And so one of the beauties of looking at the way you look at peacemaking and the beauty of how we look at peacemaking is that we are trying to help people make peace within themselves so that they can be a better version of themselves for them and others. You're looking at peacemaking from a standpoint of an argument that you're having with another human being. When it's that discourse inside of ourselves that we have to really start with to improve people and all of our actions and the interactions we have with others. So I'm loving this conversation. Just what role do you think social media plays in popularizing this outright refusal to have genuine discourse?
Well, before I get to that, if I could, I love what you were just saying, because habit 9 that I find really good peacemakers engage in is they spend a lot of time trying to seek inner peace. They try to identify those topics that leave them in kind of a high state of agitation, and then figure out how they can find some peace on those topics. And they try to keep themselves in a state of inner peace as they navigate their lives, so that when difficult conversations arise, they can handle them and employ all these other topics, right? And so I give lots of different habits in the book about how people can kind of achieve that state of inner peace. So I love that you were talking about that. I also want to emphasize, you know, I've been talking about disputes that are on a longer burn, right? If you're talking like a religious dispute or a big political dispute or some geopolitical situation, you're not going to solve that two people arguing about it in one scenario, in one sitting. It may take years to have conversations and reach some sort of agreement. But what about something where you just have to reach a solution, right? If you're talking about business people or lawyers, hey, we have a disagreement about how we're going to resolve this case and what argument we're going to make to a judge. We got to decide tonight. We got to put the argument in the brief and get it filed. How do you solve those? And all these techniques can work there just as much as in any other scenario. I was just in a situation a few months ago where we were making an argument to the Supreme Court of Texas in a case, and I was, as a professor, sometimes I'll be involved in litigation. And we had a serious dispute about an argument to make, a core argument about constitutional law and what it should be. We had to make a decision. The brief had a deadline. It had to be filed. I couldn't just say, hey, it's nice that I understand your position on this. We'll come back to it in a few months, right? Like, we had to make a decision. But for me, acknowledging to this other attorney, my co-counsel, that they had raised a good point, that it was in, quote, within the realm of reasonableness. I think this is a reasonable argument, and acknowledging why it was reasonable, and then explaining to them why I felt like there was something better, showing my expertise, which was considerably more than this other person, but without saying, hey, I'm the expert, you'll do what I say, but laying out lots of facts and data to show the expertise, resulted in a great outcome where he saw that and he felt heard. He felt like his argument was understood. And then I had given kind of enough information for him to be able to say, yeah, you're right. What you're suggesting is better. And he's done the same to me, and it's a working relationship, right? So I don't want listeners to come away with the idea of thinking peacemaking is about never reaching conclusions. As business leaders and as lawyers and others, we all have to, lawmakers, police, right? We all have to reach conclusions sometimes in a very short fuse, but you can use all these same techniques to reach short-term conclusions when you have to. Now, that's to your question. Social media. So I talk about this a lot in chapter 2, where peacemakers engage in what I call real learning and habits to engage in real learning about topics. Social media teaches us to do the absolute exact opposite. Social media is now designed, and by social media, we should actually expand it out to basically all of the modern media ecosystem, including just your normal news websites, but also social media as we traditionally think of it. But we should also think like YouTube, even, quite frankly, various podcasts, places like Spotify that feed you what you think you'll be interested in, right? It's very hard to engage in real learning if you are being spoon-fed information by our modern ecosystem. If you want to engage in, because it's going to just give you more and more and more of what you've shown interest in, making your knowledge about a given topic increasingly limited, right? So we have to consciously go out. If somebody likes this podcast, I would encourage them to go find out another podcast about the same topic from a different perspective. Go hunt it out. It's not, the algorithms are not going to feed it to you. You have to hunt them out and go find different sources of knowledge. Social media is designed to not do that, and it's really caused a lot of the problems we're seeing in society today about the ability to have discourse and this false polarization I talked about.
I love that. I love it.
Yeah.
That is so it's a relief to hear that. I think those
Right.
I just heard a big going on around the world.
Well, if I
think
can tell you what's crazy about it is the gambling industry many decades ago had PhDs in psychology who came to understand the dopamine reward systems in our brains and how to get people addicted. And so they mastered this, right? And we all know that. We know gambling's addictive, and we know casinos are designed to keep us there. And it is a chemical addiction that psychologists understood, and they actually figured out mathematical equations for when to give people rewards when they're gambling, so that every moment somebody's about getting ready to walk away, they'll win just enough to keep them there, right? And they get a reward and they want to stay, this variable reward system. Well, The social media companies took all of that research developed by the gambling industry and they put it into all of the social media apps and all of our smartphones and things like YouTube, all the algorithms. And when we are talking about using social media and trying to overcome its influence on us, it's not Kathy against her phone or Kathy against the Instagram app where your own self-will could help you overcome it. You are fighting teams of psychologists and mathematicians whose whole goal is to keep you addicted. And one of the ways they do that is by feeding you more and more and more of the singular things you're interested in, which makes it really hard to then have a conversation with someone who's being fed something else completely by the same algorithms, right?
Well, one of the things we talked about is one of the tools that we use is this, assumption ladder I mentioned. You got data, rung one at the bottom, and selection of data. So social media is giving us the selection of data versus us trying to make our own opinion about that. So, we've lost some autonomy in our own thinking about what's important because they've fed it to us. And like you said, it's so in line with what we're already thinking, it feels good. It must, because it feels good and it's in line with my thinking. That's the confirmation bias that maybe you could say a word about that. Therefore, I believe it even more. And I'm going to argue more because of that.
Yeah, I mean, confirmation bias was already a problem, right? That we would go and like read headlines that already agree with us. But now, news and social media outfits are feeding us the very things we've already shown a bias towards. And it's actually so prevalent that if you go read a news source like the Washington Post, and if let's say you and I both read the Washington Post, we are reading two different news sources now online. The Washington Post will tailor the headlines I receive based on and the stories I get on my homepage based on what I've shown an interest in, and they will tailor them to you based on what you've shown an interest in. We're not even in the same reality and with the starting data points.
It's even worse than that, Stephen. And we want to close on a high note, I'm sure, but I want to end my portion of this on this subject with the following. There will never be AI that does what we want it to do because it doesn't have EI. It doesn't have emotional intelligence. And now we're working in this arena to correct that when there's so much garbage that has gone onto the internet that people are believing is the answer they're seeking when they ask AI, right, Chat GPT, to give them information on a subject. So I always tell people, beware, beware, beware. If you went in right now and said, who created emotional brilliance? There's only two people that have a trademark on emotional brilliance. You're talking to them, Relly Neff and Kathy Greenberg. But if you go to Chat GPT and ask who did that, it will give you every other human being's name in the industry of emotional intelligence, like Dan Goleman or Reuven Bar-On, because the system doesn't know the difference between nuance. And we're going to be fighting this forever and ever until people start recognizing what it's doing to us. And that's why lawyers and counselors and coaches and therapists will never be able to escape having to do the real work because you cannot use Chat GPT to AI your way through any of those subjects.
Right. And good peacemakers are deliberately aware of it and deliberately trying to overcome it, right? If they want to talk about a topic, they go and they hunt for the different perspectives and arguments on it. They don't let the internet or algorithms feed them perspectives. They go hunt for them and they educate themselves. And that's, if you want to end on a high note, that's what good leaders and peacemakers do in the business world, in the legal world, in academia, in families. In all these different places where we have difficult topics, they don't allow themselves to be manipulated.
Beautiful.
So, Stephen, I'll ask you the last question here, and this is kind of part of a different question in our lightning round. So, what's your go-to? Kathy, in our book, Emotional Brilliance, we talk about the go-to. You're in a situation, you get that sense that this is a conflict. What's your immediate go-to? What do you grab? What do you say, okay, here's my next strategy?
I usually start with intellectual humility and trying to understand better the situation and the source of the conflict before I engage. I always want to understand, why do we actually have a conflict here before I engage? Because usually it's not what I assumed it was at the beginning. And once I know the source, I can help find a solution.
Beautiful. I love it.
All right, Kathy, why don't you bring us on home here?
Bring us on home. Well, first of all, Stephen, thank you for spending your valuable time with us today. Thank you on behalf of our audience. And thank you, audience, for always wanting to tune up your leadership with us here on Leadership Development News, the #1 ranked leadership development channel by FeedSpot. Take good care, everybody. Until next time.